Well, I can see a good amount of people joined. Marisa, if you would like to start.
Yeah, will do. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining the ABD Society for our March speaker series. We have Jasmine Wazaney with us today. Jasmine is the Director of Data Analytics and Reporting at HealthStat Inc. and is extremely passionate about data. Since working at HealthStat, Jasmine has evolved into a thought leader, a subject matter expert, and sits on multiple committees, getting involved on the technical and clinical side of things. She plays an important role in maintaining HealthStat's NCQA and AAAHC certifications, in building QI studies and white papers, as well as supporting some key relationships with the Johns Hopkins ACG population health teams and the eClinicalWorks community analytics population health teams. I also wanted to, before I hand it over to Jasmine, also wanted to remind everyone of our next event is going to be on April 29th. That's the speaker series as well. And then Jasmine, if you just can flip to the next slide. Real quick.
Yeah, trying. There we go.
Also would love to encourage everyone to connect with us on our social media accounts. We would love to have you. We've got all of them listed here today. All right, so Jasmine, I'm going to turn it over to you. And I think we're going to start with a poll as well. So you'll see a poll pop up.
Awesome. Do you want me to go ahead and get started while
sure.
doing that? Okay, cool. All right. Well, thank you for that introduction. And for everybody that's joined, a lot of you actually know me in person, and I am such a data nerd, so I'm super excited to be here. And I am also very passionate about what I do in the healthcare industry. And so that's why today's topic is going to be specific to healthcare analytics. And one of the things I wanted to start out by saying, though, is we've talked a lot about HealthStat Inc. We're now Everside Health, and so didn't want to confuse everybody by changing it up, but we've recently gone through an acquisition, so you'll see Everside Health throughout the slide. But I am coming from 6+ years with HealthStat. And so again, the topic of today is going to be healthcare optimization through data visualization. And so I'm really excited to kind of talk through some of the experience. The topics that I'll talk about is specifically kind of pre-pandemic analytics, population health, post-pandemic analytics and population health, and then kind of getting into the data visualization, best practices, as well as open sources, BI platforms, and then more. So before I kick it off, you may or may not have ever heard of Everside Health or HealthStat Inc. And basically, we are near-site, on-site, work-site health centers, and we offer services for primary care to essentially utilize technology, create patient-focused commitment to reduce healthcare costs and value. All right, so talking about pre-pandemic analytics and population health management, I'm going to go into some of the stuff that I have personal experience working with. And so prior to the pandemic, we had a focus more on impacting the population's health in a number of ways. So what do I mean by optimization? So let's start there. So optimization in the data world covers essentially 4 different things. So hindsight, taking the data, looking at it and understanding what happened, utilizing the data for insight, why did it happen, and then utilizing the data for foresight, what's going to happen, and then the action, which you guys hear me say this a lot, is so what can we do. And so when I talk about optimization as it relates to healthcare optimization, our real life application is specific to population health and predictive modeling. And so in healthcare, there's a number of tools that you can utilize for predictive modeling, but I have personal experience with the Johns Hopkins ACG model, which is a very well-known predictive model, risk stratification model, and has been around for 30 plus years. So in the same concept of what we just looked at in terms of hindsight, what happened? So we utilize the data that we have to understand retrospective and create concurrent risk. So the risk of the patient based on the activities prior to, and what are those markers? We utilize that data to understand, well, why is this important? What can we learn from it? Is it really informative? And there's a number of ways that it can be informative. How do you address that patient in their care if you don't know anything about them? So this is where it becomes very valuable. This is where the ACG model takes it another step forward, which is that predictive component, the foresight. What's going to happen, especially if there's no intervention, right? If there's no care, if there's nothing that protects that patient from worsening, if you will. So that's the importance of that predictive analytics. And we use it for, again, a number of things like risk stratification and pricing in terms of what was the current cost, what's the kind of predicted spend. And then lastly, action, right? What can we do about it? How can we actually be proactive instead of reactive? And then can we approach these with preventative measures? So just to give you an idea, I typically do a lot of work with diabetes data, diabetes self-management programs. And there's a lot of activity that you can implement to prevent. So this is where those preventative measures come into play. You can do lifestyle management, even healthy behaviors, a lot of different pieces can play into how do we prevent from somebody moving into some of these higher risk categories. So we did put the poll out, and can we get the results for the first one, data-driven decision-making? All right, so this is really cool. So 94% of you said yes, and only 6% of you said no. And I am really not surprised that you guys have all heard about data-driven decision-making, because this will play into kind of the future of where we're talking now, post-pandemic, but I'll get to that in a second. So when we talk about data-driven decision-making, there's a couple of measures that go into play, which is we have to define what the objectives are. What are we trying to do? And then understand that there's a component where we have to actually gather the data for that. And I'll talk at a later point about data governance and a data culture. We then take that data, we analyze it, we try to understand it, we find unresolved questions, we find specific data needs to solve those questions. It's this continual process of revisiting and reevaluating, presenting the data, which is what I'll get to when we talk about visualizations, setting measurable goals. I always say if it isn't measured, it can't be improved, and if it isn't documented, it can't be tracked. So it's really important to have that underlying data, and then just to continue to evolve, continue to learn, and make sure that you're guarding against biases. And so that's where people with statistical backgrounds, mathematical backgrounds really help in saying, okay, there's an outlier. That's maybe something we need to look into. So I'm going to slide this into talking more about post-pandemic analytics and population health management. So I had already referenced the ACG model, but as you guys know, CDC put out specific factors that identified somebody higher risk for severe illness as it came to COVID-19. And so why is this important to kind of risk stratify any population that you're touching for the purposes of COVID-19? For us, it was education, making sure that we educate the patient on all of the things that they need to do to protect themselves, to do outreach in terms of, hey, are you doing okay? A lot of people have brought up mental health in this whole pandemic, and understanding that it's really important to stay connected. Also engagement. I'll talk a little bit later about how we, as an organization and in the healthcare industry, pivoted. What could we do to increase engagement, increase utilization, and utilizing the data for us to understand where should we target. And a lot of that was obviously the healthcare industry turned to virtual care and telephonic care. Intrinsic motivation. So understanding the data, understanding the power behind the data, and just being motivated by the behavior of it and wanting to help and wanting to make a difference. We utilize this risk stratification to implement return to work strategies, testing strategies, and now with the vaccine administration strategies. This is just a simple graphic that I had put together utilizing some of the Johns Hopkins ArcGIS dashboard data. On the left-hand side, you can see this was kind of day one of tracking, January 22nd of 2022, there was one confirmed case. You'll see some other colors, and that's where I overlaid some additional information where it would be really helpful for us in terms of building out our strategy as an organization and how to target our overall population. And if you look at the top, there's like a play button, a stop button. It's really interesting to kind of watch this play out and see how it went from one case to now 29+ million cases, right, on the right-hand side, where it's population level. So the purpose of me showing this, though, is because it's important to monitor this information so that you can take action, that you utilize data actionably, and that you use it for its insights and information. So this is a graphic that the CDC put together. It's fairly basic, but it tells a pretty healthy story in terms of I can pinpoint high points, low points, as it relates to hospitalization rates. When was it the highest? Where are we now? And again, this is data March 1st through November of 2020. But you can see those trends, and you'll hear that a lot in the healthcare industry as well as in the mathematical world, which is trend analysis. Are you looking at the trends? Are you understanding, monitoring, and then utilizing this information to make a difference? So when you're utilizing the data, there's some really important things to remember, which are best practices and misinformation. This was huge when it came to the data around COVID-19. And this was probably my favorite quote that came out of it. Misinformation spreads faster than COVID-19. Think before sharing it. As a data nerd, I just find that hilarious, but it's true, right? Like if you misinform the population, not everybody's data savvy, not everybody understands what the data is telling them. And so they can take that information and misuse it, misunderstand it, be more concerned than they actually need to be. So it's really important to explain labels, terminology, being consistent with what you're saying. Don't use the same word and represent it different at a later point. Continue to show those trends over time. Include overall totals. Don't forget to normalize. So I bring this up because we saw that a lot in the beginning, where this is how many cases there were, but nobody really adjusted it at the beginning in terms of cases versus tests. So there were states that were testing more than other states and had different access to testing. And so of course their numbers are going to be higher. They have more data around testing. So also understanding that correlation is not causation. Correct data is really important as well, and we can talk about that later, but keeping it simple. And then on the right-hand side, these are kind of words that I live by as it relates to data: quality data, trustworthy data, and being completely transparent with the data. If you're transparent with the data, it's more actionable, you can learn more, you can make an impact. Here's a little example I found really interesting. There's this article that that got published with Tableau, and it's what the BBC got wrong in their COVID-19 visualization. I put the link here and we'll share this after the fact, but you can see that these are two very different looking graphs. The one on the left side, I mean, it looks crazy high for that 80+ population for the case fatality ratio for ages 80 and above. But in reality, you're looking at it on a scale of 0 to 15, right? On the right-hand side, you're looking at a scale of 0 to 100. So now this puts things into perspective in terms of, okay, it's not as scary as we thought it is, right? It's still not great, but just having different axes can impact what we see in the data. So going back to transparency is key. I went through this project with HealthStat in terms of really working with known advisors in the industry that have been around in the healthcare industry that had great advice, working with our clients, working with consultants to build out something that we thought embraced all of that I've talked about thus far, right? Creating this reporting package that it was insightful, it was actionable, and really helped identify performance. And what was really important to me and the organization was transparency, as I mentioned, right? We build strategy around data. Our world is getting savvier as we talk about data every day now, especially with COVID-19. And so we need to be able to speak to that data intelligently. And that means building out that model, but it takes time. And again, with transparency is key. You can't create action items if everything looks pretty, if everything looks perfect, right? How do you know where you need to target or where you need to impact if everything looks like it's going perfectly fine? And as we evolve into this world that's got this data culture, it became very apparent that that's what our clients wanted. That's what our consultants wanted. They wanted the real facts. They wanted, you know, they didn't want to just hear like you have these awesome numbers. They wanted to see if there's low utilization, why, what are we going to do about it, right? So what, now what? So when you're building out something like the reporting package that we did, we really built it through storyboarding initially, and we asked ourselves these questions. Who's the audience? Who am I trying to tell the story to? What questions am I trying to answer? What am I trying to say? But also, what is the data trying to tell me? I always say that my passion is giving a voice to the data because it has so much information that we can pull out of it. And it's just a matter of getting that into people's hands in a digestible manner where it's insightful, and it really does fuel further exploration and spark inspiration. So you can see the storyboard here. The reporting package that we build out really followed this story so that everybody could streamline having that same conversation. Now, the data that fell into that story wasn't always the same, but we had that same story. Essentially, is the population healthy, happy? Are they going to utilize? They're going to engage if they're happy. And that rounds all the way out to improvement in health and improvement in spend. So with the data visualizations, this is really important, and I know that was the kind of the key thing that I wanted to talk about today, and I know we're getting close to time, but humans are super visual creatures by nature, so you have to draw your audience in, you have to inform at a glance. And so you have to put those benchmarks in there. There's going to be a need for identifiable patterns and immediate takeaways. So utilize color. Do it delicately. You don't want to overwhelm people, but you have to be associative and intuitive about it. So some examples are hot and cold, right? Red or blue, stop and go, green and red, good and bad, you know, red and green, and sometimes yellow. So, you know, these are things that people already make connections with. And same thing with size matters, right? You know, if you are showing something that's really important, you want to enlarge that number, you want to make it super prevalent in the customer's eye, and then make it logical, right? Like if it's a bad number, you don't want it to be green with all of these like sparkles in it. Doesn't make sense to the customer. That doesn't make sense to whoever is viewing this information. Rounding that all out with less is more, right? Key pieces that can be informative. And you can use text. You need to be smart about how you use the text, but that text may add additional context. When it comes to data visualizations in today's world, especially with dashboarding, it's really important that you start to think through self-service, interactivity. That can make a huge difference because they're going to ask questions if you do it right, and they want to be able to drill down to learn more information. So you want to guide that story. We talked about storyboarding earlier. And encourage those questions. And you want people to be inquisitive. You want people to look at that data and say, not question the data, but build questions around the data. And again, making it user-friendly. So adding instructions. One of the things that was really important to me, I said earlier, but I'll say it again, is transparency. We built a glossary where it actually broke down definitions, calculations, sample calculations. We wanted everybody to understand and have that resource available. So here's an example of something that the CDC put together as it relates to the age-adjusted COVID-19 hospitalization rates by race and ethnicity. And so you're looking at race and ethnicity at the bottom. You saw that was really snazzy. Those graphics are moving. You can see the numbers. They're super prominent. You can see the rate per 100,000 of the population on the left-hand side. There's data there for context. Now, this isn't a dashboard, but this is just a simple graphic that I can immediately see what they're trying to tell me with this information. Here's another one. Now, it's not as snazzy as the last one, but it does help us understand that story. So kind of combining that idea about race and ethnicity, COVID-19 vaccines, you see that the different populations are having different access to the vaccines, and you're seeing that in the percentages. So any data person would look at this and say, okay, we need to dig deeper. We need to understand what's going on here. How can we make a difference here? And so here's another way. Now, this is flu vaccine, but it's kind of a really cool visual in terms of showing the lowest rates, the highest rates, the average. I pinpoint numbers. I see the states. I see the race and ethnicity on the left-hand side. I see those percentages across the bottom, and it really helps me identify. So what's the advantage here, though? With integrity and data integrity, I think there's an importance here of we're witnessing an impact of COVID-19 in real time in a number of different domains, and the gaps are super evident, as you just saw in those graphics. So it's what we do with that knowledge that makes a difference. And, you know, knowledge is power. So you want to, as a data person, you almost feel obligated to look deeper and help build strategy around it. So here I've kind of got that timeline or that view into here's the pandemic. We see the data, we start tracking data, we identify disparities, we identify inequity, and we understand that there's gaps in care. So how do you take that data and make it actionable? For those of you that live in North Carolina, you know, love it or hate it, here's what we did as a state. North Carolina made a commitment to equitable distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. And, you know, you can access this information to read the full article, but a couple of things that I pulled out of it was 65% increase in the weekly number of first doses because we took this initiative based on the data, right? North Carolina became one of the first states in the US to release statewide race and ethnicity data for vaccines so that we could be proactive. They actually created a state hotline where you can not only ask questions, find vaccine locations, but that they can help you with transportation services. If you go to the site, you'll also identify that they approach health literacy and inclusivity with different options for the information. So there's options to see this in Spanish, there's options for it to be visuals and really, address all of these components. And then as of a release just yesterday, the CDC released a report that put North Carolina in the top 10 states in the nation for equitable vaccine distribution. And then Sunday, Bloomberg News recognized North Carolina as a leader in the nation for reporting demographic data. And quote, North Carolina is among the best performing US states when it comes to distributing vaccines evenly among Black and white residents. That's partly because the state is by far the best at collecting demographic data. But again, you don't have the data. How are you going to do that? So with COVID-19, there was a lot of open sources and BI platforms that you could utilize. I personally like to access GitHub. It's a free data source. On the left-hand side, this is the Johns Hopkins data that they had put together. That's live. It changes every day. On the right-hand side, this is something that I've recently started working with, which is ADI. So that's the Area Deprivation Index, which is really important for social determinants of health, going back to the equity and disparities. MuleSoft, AWS, Data.World, there's a number of them. So get out there. There's a lot of resources. Again, data is knowledge. In terms of business intelligence platforms, I've worked with multiple platforms, but you can always go to the Gartner Magic Quadrant to understand where people land. And the idea is to make sure that you have the ability to execute, but you're also an innovator. And so where do you land? So these are the 2020 results. You can see in the leaders are both Microsoft and Tableau, both tools that I've used before. And you can kind of see where the distribution of the other ones land. And it's not that they're bad, but they did this quadrant to understand where's the completeness of the vision, what's the ability to execute. And if you're in the corporate world, execution is key. So we did a poll on GIGO, which is probably one of my favorites, and I'm excited that only 17% of you said you do know what it is. So all my computer science nerds are not on the call because this is an acronym for garbage in, garbage out. That's super important when you're talking about data and making sure that you start this legacy of the data is not wrong, right? It's just a matter of like, what's going into the system? What type of data are we tracking? Are we tracking important information? And so that's where this conversation about data culture comes into play. Every piece of data that we have and we suss out, it needs to be insightful, it needs to be meaningful, and it needs to be actionable. And in the healthcare industry, when it comes to tracking a lot of the healthcare data, it's all about coding. It's all about documentation. But you can't blame the provider if you haven't trained them to document in that manner. And then you can't get that data if they don't know that they need to document it that way. So you have to build this culture of data where everybody's on board with understanding strategy is key. And thanks to COVID, this is forefront for all of us. When you search in Google North Carolina COVID data, this is the first thing that pops up, which I was like, wow, this would never have existed years ago. But they immediately pop up with graphics and cases and statistics. And, you know, we're really moving into this data culture. And so I'm kind of appreciative to the pandemic in terms of learning and then taking that step to learn even more, where this is a graphic that I adore, which is looking at not just the cases that are occurring, but then layering in different things like the policy decisions, where there are restrictions, where there are openings. And again, correlation is not always causation, but this is where you can start to dive in deeper and understand if that was the impact. We are done. So I didn't leave a whole lot of time for questions. I apologize. I know we're right at the top of the time, but I really appreciate all of you guys. This is something that I'm very passionate about, and it's really important, like I said, to give a voice to that data and make sure that we're taking advantage of it. And if you are a comic book nerd and you know Spider-Man, it's kind of that, like, with knowledge and with great power comes great responsibilities. And so as data people, it's going to be really important for us to, take the obligatory response of doing something with what we see. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jasmine. We did get a few questions in the Q&A, but I know we're at time, so we will pass those questions over to you, Jasmine, and you can answer our question askers. But thank you so much. This was very helpful and insightful. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.